When the Civil War ended in 1865, hundreds of thousands of Confederate soldiers surrendered. Many walked away from the battlefield and went home. But tens of thousands were still being held in Union prisoner of war camps. Their future was uncertain. They did not know when they would be released, whether they would face punishment, or how they would rebuild their lives in a country that had just defeated them. Some went home within days. Others waited weeks or months. A few died before they ever saw freedom again. Their stories reveal how complicated the end of the war truly was. This video looks at what happened to Confederate prisoners of war after 1865 and how they transitioned from soldiers to civilians in a changed country. When Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April, 1865, the surrender terms applied to his army alone. No one yet knew what would happen to the tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers still locked inside Union camps across the North and the South. At the time, the United States held Confederate prisoners in dozens of locations. Some of the largest were Camp Douglas in Chicago's Elmira Prison, in New York Southern Point Lookout in Maryland Southern Rock Island, in Illinois Sun Camp Chase in Ohio Sud. Fort Delaware life inside these camps had been harsh since the beginning of the war. Food was limited, disease was constant, medical care was poor. Many prisoners were sick, underweight, and exhausted by the time the war was over. Even after word of Lee's surrender spread, the prisoners did not know whether they would be released or punished for fighting against the United States. Rumors moved through the camps faster than official orders. Some believed they might be kept for years. Others feared execution. Most were simply tired and wanted to go home. When Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured on May 10, 1865, the final hope of a continued Confederate government collapsed. For prisoners, the news created a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because the war was truly over. Anxiety because no one knew what the United States would do with Confederate soldiers. Now that the rebellion had officially ended, would they face trials? Would they be banned from voting or owning property? Would they be allowed to return home at all? The uncertainty lingered for weeks. The United States government had to make a decision quickly. Keeping tens of thousands of prisoners fed and guarded was expensive and risky. Disease could break out, tension could rise, and families were desperate to reunite. Federal officials decided that most Confederate prisoners would be released if they swore an oath of allegiance to the United States. For many soldiers, this felt like a humiliation, but the alternative was to remain behind bars with no clear future. Almost all chose to take the oath. The oath usually read, "I do solemnly swear that I will support, protect, and defend the Constitution and the Union, and that I will faithfully abide by and carry out all laws and proclamations regarding slavery. So help me God." Once a prisoner signed the oath, he received a parole pass. This document allowed him to travel home without being arrested by Union patrols or local authorities. For many former Confederates, that piece of paper became one of the most treasured items they owned. Releasing tens of thousands of prisoners was not simple. Some camps began paroling men immediately after the war ended. Others waited for weeks while officials confirmed names, organized transportation, and prepared rations for long journeys home. Some camps emptied quickly. Others emptied in waves. A few continued holding prisoners until late summer. Elmira Prison, one of the deadliest camps of the war, did not release its final prisoners until July 1865. Some men had already died in the months after Lee's surrender, too sick to survive the wait. Point Lookout, with more than 20,000 prisoners at its height, slowly released men throughout the spring and summer. Camp Douglas, known for brutal conditions, also took time to discharge its prisoners, partly because officials had to rebuild transportation lines that had been damaged by the war. For many prisoners, freedom came slowly, step by painful step. Once paroled, former Confederate prisoners had to make their way back to their homes in the defeated South. Many were hundreds of miles away with no money, limited rations, and almost no clothing. Some traveled by train if seats were available. Others walked. Many hitched rides on wagons heading south. A few floated down rivers when they could find boats. The journey was dangerous. Bridges were destroyed. Railroads were broken. Towns along the way were short on supplies. Disease traveled with them. Exhaustion slowed them down. Men who had been weakened by months in prison collapsed on roadsides or in churches offering shelter. But despite these hardships, most managed to reach home. Their arrival was emotional. Families had feared them dead. Some returned to find their parents gone, siblings scattered, or farms destroyed. Their homecoming brought joy, but also revealed how deeply the war had changed everything. Confederate prisoners who returned home discovered a South that barely resembled the one they had left. Slavery was gone. The economy was broken. Railroads, towns, and farms had been destroyed. Former slave owners were struggling. Freed people were asserting their rights. Federal troops were stationed in southern cities. In prison, men had imagined returning to familiar lives. Instead, they returned to a region undergoing radical transformation. Some were welcomed by communities still proud of their service. Others returned to places where survival mattered more than old loyalties. Many realized they now had to compete for jobs with other former soldiers and newly freed men. For thousands, poverty became a permanent part of life. Many Confederate POWs suffered lifelong health problems. Prison camps had been breeding grounds for TB, smallpox, fondant dysentery, pneumonia, thigh scurvy, thigh infection, tuberculosis. Some prisoners had lost limbs or suffered untreated wounds. Others had starved for months. Many died during the journey home. Others lived only a year or two after returning. Families often described the returning men as ghosts of themselves. They looked older than their age and carried emotional scars that no one recognized at the time. Today, historians estimate that around 50,000 Confederate prisoners died in captivity during the war. Thousands more died soon after release. Once home, former prisoners had to rebuild their lives without the structure of military service. This transition was difficult. Many had no money, no tools, no livestock, no seeds for planting. Some moved in with relatives. Others worked as farm laborers until they could lease or buy land. Many became sharecroppers. A few moved west to seek new opportunities on the frontier. Marriage rates rose sharply in the years after the war. Many former POWs started families quickly, hoping to replace the sense of home and belonging they had lost. A small number struggled to reintegrate and fell into alcoholism or violence. Today, we would recognize their symptoms as post-traumatic stress. But at the time, these conditions had no name. Confederate officers received slightly different treatment from ordinary soldiers. Those suspected of war crimes, abuse of prisoners, or involvement in massacres faced investigation. Some officers remained imprisoned until late 1865 or early 1866. A few were held even longer. For example, Henry Words, the commandant of Andersonville Prison, was tried and executed for war crimes. Others were charged, but eventually released due to lack of evidence. Most officers, however, were paroled like ordinary soldiers. They returned home, resumed professional careers, and in many cases entered politics. Some later helped shape the lost cause narrative. Even after parole, former Confederate prisoners lived under suspicion. They needed their parole passes to travel. Some local officials refused to recognize their rights. Federal occupation forces watched them closely. Any sign of rebellion could lead to arrest. But as the months passed, suspicion faded. The United States government wanted peace, not endless punishment. By 1866, most former POWs were ordinary citizens again. As years passed, former Confederate POWs joined veterans groups, including the United Confederate Veterans. They shared stories of camp life, suffering, and survival. They attended reunions and built monuments dedicated to the boys in gray. Their memories became part of Southern culture. Many books and memoirs describe the prison experience in vivid detail, often emphasizing hardship and sacrifice. Some leaned into exaggeration or selective memory, but they helped shape how later generations understood the war. The experience of imprisonment shaped former Confederates for the rest of their lives. It taught them resilience, but also left them wary of federal authority. It contributed to the bitterness that fueled resistance during Reconstruction. It also gave veterans a shared identity that lasted long after the war. Some became teachers, ministers, or local leaders. Others lived quietly and avoided public life. A few never recovered physically or emotionally. Their children grew up hearing stories of hunger, cold, and survival. These stories became part of the foundation of Southern memory and influenced how the next generation understood the war. When the Civil War ended, Confederate prisoners of war faced a long and difficult road home. They were freed slowly, cautiously, and under strict conditions. Many were sick, many were starving. Some never made it home at all. Those who did return found a changed South and had to rebuild their lives from the ground up. Their experiences shaped communities, families, and Southern memory for generations. Their story is a reminder that a war does not end cleanly. Even after the battles stop, the struggles continue, often quietly and out of sight. Thank you for watching. If you want more videos like this, let us know in the comments. We will see you in the next one.